Hello, and welcome to another video in our module about the building blocks of life. In a previous video, we talked about atoms and molecules, and we talked about how multiple atoms can come together to make molecules. And then we talked about how very large combinations of atoms can make important molecules in the human body, like DNA, like proteins, like lipids and fats, and that those molecules are very important for cells, for the cells in the human body. And in this lecture, we're going to talk more about cells. What are cells? What do they do in the body? What do they need? And what are some common problems that can happen to the cells in our body? And learning about cells is important because cells are the building blocks for organs. So the organs in our body, like our heart, our lungs, our brain, our eyes, nearly everything in our body is made up of cells. Millions and millions of cells. And all these cells together, they make up organs, and the organs make up our human body. And so today, we will be focusing on cells, and this will be important to understanding how organs work and ultimately how the body works. So without further ado, So like I said, cells are the basic building block of the human body. Our human body is made up of millions and millions of different cells. And there are many different types of cells that do different jobs in the body. And so we will talk about some of those different jobs that cells do in the body. We will talk about some of the things that cells need to be healthy. And we will also talk about some problems that can happen with our cells. And when problems happen to our cells, this can lead to disease. And this can make people sick. And so I look forward to discussing these topics with you today. As a reminder, please remember that the content in these videos is to help you in your education, but they're not a replacement for getting a professional education, and make sure that you are always following the guidelines of your local health authorities when caring for patients. Alrighty, on this slide, we have a diagram that shows some of the basic parts of a human cell. Inside of a human cell, we see here in the center what is called the nucleus. In drawings, the nucleus often appears darker than the rest of the cell. And in the nucleus, that's where the cell's DNA is stored. And you might remember from our previous video that DNA has your genes. Your DNA determines what color eyes you have. It helps determine how tall you are, what color your skin is. Your DNA determines a lot about you. And the way DNA does this is DNA gives instructions to the cells. It has your genes, and the genes tell your cell what proteins to make. It tells your cell what molecules to make, and those proteins determine what jobs your cell does in the human body. And so this very important DNA, it's stored in the nucleus of your cells. Another important part of your cell is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the sac around the outside of the cell that helps hold the cell together. And so in the diagrams, these are some parts of the cell that you should be able to easily recognize. There are some other parts of cells that you will notice, right? These different structures you can see inside the cell membrane, but they're outside of the nucleus, right? Here's the nucleus, here's the cell membrane, but we see here a little structure. They call this a mitochondria. We have another little structure here, another structure, and these structures we will talk about in our next video. Today we're going to focus on some of the main jobs that cells do, but we will go into detail about the different parts of cells in our next video. On this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between human cells and the cells that make up bacteria. So in a human cell, we have the cell membrane, like we discussed, and we have the nucleus. And inside the nucleus, we have our DNA. Bacteria, they are a bit different. Bacteria also have a cell membrane. Many of them have molecules on their cell membrane that help protect the bacteria. So this can be part of the bacteria's defenses. Inside the bacteria, there is its DNA. But bacteria don't have a nucleus the same way that human cells do. There are several other differences between human cells and bacteria, but we won't discuss all of them here. It is also common for some bacteria to have a flagellum, and this is a part of the bacteria that it can use to move. And so this could help the bacteria to move away from danger, or maybe to move towards things that it wants. Here we have another diagram of a human cell. I like this diagram because it looks a little more three-dimensional. On the outside, you can see here the cell membrane. It is the sac that goes around the cell. And can you see where the nucleus is? Here is the nucleus. It is this dark area in the cell. And the DNA is stored in the nucleus. And then the cell can use that DNA, like we discussed, to make proteins. And then those proteins can do important things in the cell. Also in the cell, you can see in this diagram, there are these little structures, and these are called organelles. And they do important jobs in the cell. And like I said, we will discuss the different types of organelles more in a later video and talk about their important jobs. Now that we have talked a little bit about the structure of cells, the different parts of cells, I want to talk about some examples of cells in the human body. In this image here, this is a diagram of our skin. This is the surface of the skin. So if you touch your arm or your leg, this is the surface of the skin that you are touching. And you can see that the skin is made up of lots of little cells. Each one of these little circles with the dot in the middle is a cell. And the dot, that's the nucleus. A nucleus, another nucleus, a nucleus, a nucleus, a nucleus, a nucleus. And so each of these cells here is attached to the other cells. And together, all these cells form a protective layer covering your body, and that is your skin. And down here, this is where the new cells form, And over time, as the cells get older, they move to the surface where they die and then they fall off. And this is how the cells work together to make your skin to help protect your body. Inside the body, every cell has a job to do. We talked about the cells in your skin, how skin cells help to form a protective covering over your body. They help keep germs out of your body, and they help keep water and other important nutrients inside your body, right? So if the bacteria and germs outside your body cannot get in to your body because the skin helps protect you. Now, if the skin in your body is damaged, for example, imagine that you are cooking and you accidentally cut yourself with a knife. So imagine this is the knife here, and your skin cells are cut. So right now I'm cutting into the skin cells. After the skin is damaged, those cells can multiply and they can heal the damage. And you've seen this before when you got a cut on your arm or on your leg. Eventually your skin was able to heal so that the cut, it is no longer visible, or maybe you had a scar left over. There are other types of cells in your body that do important jobs. Another type of cell is the muscle cell. So I'm going to try to draw someone's arm here, a strong person's arm. I'm sorry if my artwork is not the best. So imagine this is a very strong person's arm, right? So you can see here they have a lot of muscle on their arm. Muscle cells have a distinct shape that relates to the job they do in the body. And so inside this person's muscle here, if you zoomed in, then you would see lots of muscle cells. And the muscle cells, they have a nucleus, and they have lots of small fibers. And when you contract that muscle, when you flex the muscle, these fibers, they pull and they get shorter. So then the muscle goes like this, becomes shorter. And this is how you can lift heavy things, because that muscle, it contracts, it pulls on your bones, and it helps you to lift things and helps you to move. So that's one example of a cell in your body and the job it does. We won't talk about all the cells in your body here, but I just wanted to give you some examples so that later, when we talk about the different organs in your body and the cells in them, you can remember how every different organ has special cells that do different jobs. In your brain, there are special cells called neurons. And these neurons, they send signals between each other, and this lets you think. So here is the nucleus of my neuron. And other neuron cells, other brain cells, they send electrical signals to the neuron. And when they reach the neuron, that electrical signal travels into the cell, and then that neuron can send the electrical signal to a different cell. We have a different cell over here. And so this is an example how the unique shape of the neuron, the brain cell, lets it do its job. These long branches help the cell to send signals to other cells in the body. We'll talk about one more group of cells. In your blood, you have many different kinds of cells. Maybe you have heard of red blood cells. Red blood cells are very common in the blood. That's why when you've had an injury and you bleed, the color of your blood is red, because the cells, they are actually the color red. And these cells, they carry oxygen. Every time you breathe in and fresh air comes into your lungs, in your lungs, these red blood cells pick up the oxygen. Right? When you breathe in, all the oxygen fills up your lungs, and these red blood cells, they pick up the oxygen, and they carry it around your body so that all the other cells in your body can have oxygen. And so there are many unique kinds of cells in these videos. You will learn about many more kinds of cells, but I just wanted to show you a couple examples of different types of cells in the body and how the unique shape of every type of cell helps it to do its job. On this slide, we're going to talk about important functions that all cells need to do to live. And so here I'm drawing for you a cell. We have the cell membrane in red and the nucleus in blue. One very important function that all cells need to do to live is they need to have energy. And the way cells get energy is they take oxygen. So I will draw here, imagine there is oxygen traveling into the cell. And you might remember in our last video we talked about different molecules like carbohydrates and lipids like fat. And so your cell will use oxygen and carbohydrates. I will draw these carbohydrates in black and some lipids in black. Your cell takes these molecules and it uses oxygen and it breaks down the chemicals, it breaks down the molecules, and it makes energy. And so this energy helps the cell to move, it helps the cell to maintain itself and do all the other important things the cell must do to stay alive. If cells don't get oxygen, if this oxygen here is stopped, then the cell will die. And this can happen pretty quickly. So all cells to live, they need oxygen and they need energy. And this energy can, it comes from carbohydrates like sugar, and it comes from lipids like fats. Another important thing that cells need to do is they need to grow and divide. You might remember earlier we talked about skin and how the cells in your skin, they are dividing, and the cells on the top, they get old and eventually they die and they come off. And so the cells underneath, they need to keep growing and dividing to make more cells. And so how does one cell make more cells? In order for that to happen, here we have a picture of a cell. In order for that to happen, first, the cell will grow larger. And in its nucleus, the cell will make more copies of the DNA. It will make a copy of the DNA. Then the cell will divide. The cell will split and become two cells. And each cell will have a copy of the DNA. And so in our example, where the skin is damaged, right? We talked about if your skin was cut with a knife and some of the cells died, in order to replace those cells, these cells would need to divide. And they would divide just like this, where the cell would grow, make copies of its DNA, and then the cell splits to make two different cells. Oh, and this is how our body maintains itself. It's how we grow, and if we have an injury, this is how we can heal. We'll also talk about another important function of cells. Cells need to be able to build structures and repair them. And so in our diagram here, we have our cell with the nucleus and the DNA in the cell. The DNA has the instructions telling how to make proteins. And so in the nucleus, the cell can use the DNA and it can make a short little strand of what we call RNA. It has the instructions to build a protein, and then the cell can take it out to the cytoplasm. That's the area out here outside of the nucleus. That's the cytoplasm. And there, the cell can make proteins. And these proteins can do different jobs. Sometimes they do jobs in the cell, and sometimes they move out of the cell, and they do important jobs in the human body. For example, cells, they can make proteins that go into the body and send signals to other cells. So if we have another cell over here, let's imagine that in your body you have an infection and there are bad bacteria that have entered your body. There's germs. So in black I've drawn these germs. This cell here on the left, it might detect these bacteria. And when it detects the bacteria, then the cell will make a hormone or make a protein, and it will send this protein out into your body. And when this protein reaches another cell, then that cell will bring it inside, and that cell will then get ready to protect against the bacteria. Because this hormone, this molecule from this cell made, it sends a message to the other cells, warning the cells to defend against bacteria. There are many examples of cells sending signals to other cells, and this is an important job that they do in the body. Another important function that cells must do in the body is they need to keep themselves in balance. In science, we call it homeostasis. So here's our cell again. And there are many things that the cell must keep in balance to stay alive and work properly. For example, inside the cell, there is water in the cytoplasm, and outside of the cell, there is water. If too much water comes into the cell, then that can put pressure on the cell and make it swell. And if too much swelling occurs, the cell could break, and then the cell would die. And so to protect itself, the cell needs to keep balance between how much water is inside the cell and outside the cell. An important way that cells help keep balance is by controlling which electrolytes can enter the cell and can leave the cell. In our last video, we talked about some common electrolytes like sodium and potassium, chlorine or chloride, and these atoms here that are floating around in your blood, the cell can move them inside or it can move them outside. And this is an important thing that your cells do to help keep your body healthy. And we'll talk about it more in later videos. And another final thing that we'll talk about here is that cells, they can also change into other kinds of cells. And we call this differentiation. For example, in your blood, there are many different kinds of cells. There are cells to carry oxygen. There are cells to fight infections and to fight germs. And there are cells to do many other jobs. And so one important thing cells can do is when the cell divides and becomes two other cells, it can change into a different kind of cell to do different jobs in your body. And we call this differentiation. If a lot of damage happens to the cell, for example, if the DNA is changed or corrupted, or lots of toxins enter into the cell, then the cell can undergo programmed death, where the cell will destroy itself because it has too much damage, and it will destroy itself to keep your body safe. All right, now that we have talked about some important functions of cells that cells do to live and keep your body healthy, now we will talk about some of the common problems that can happen to cells. And so here we have an image that shows a virus infecting a cell. So here on the outside, we can see the cell membrane that surrounds the cell. And in the middle, we can see the cell nucleus. And in the nucleus, the cell has its DNA. I'm sure you've had the experience of getting a cold, or getting the flu, or getting a stomach ache. Many times, many of these illnesses, they are caused by viruses. And a virus is a small particle that has DNA or RNA. It has genetic code in it, and it goes into your cell. And once it's in the cell, it uses its genetic instructions to tell your cell to make copies of the virus. And so you can see here that once the virus goes in, now the cell starts to make more viruses. And so your own body cells, for example, when you get the flu virus goes into your body, it infects your cell, and then your cell starts to make lots of copies of the flu virus. And then these copies of the flu virus, they go around your body and they start to infect other cells, and it spreads. And that makes you sick. Also, when you cough, those viruses, they can come out your mouth in your breath, and they can go and infect other people so that they become sick as well. So this is a common problem that can happen to cells. They can become infected by viruses. And that's why our body has to know how to fight back against viruses. Another topic that we discuss in medicine is cancer. Remember, in our cells, in the nucleus, that's where the DNA is stored. And the DNA gives instructions to our cells. Sometimes the DNA is damaged, and there are mistakes in the DNA. And these mistakes in the DNA can lead the cell to stop doing what it is supposed to do. And for example, here in the image, you can see here we have some cells that are different. They're large, and they are growing, and they don't match the other cells. These are the healthy cells and some healthy cells here. But in the middle, we have all these cells that they don't look regular. And so this is how cancer happens. Down here, I'm drawing some cells, but imagine if one of the cells has damage to its DNA. When the DNA is changed, we cause that a mutation. So now that cell that has the mutation, now it keeps dividing into more cells, and those cells divide into more cells, and they keep growing and growing, and they spread around your body. And that is how cancer happens. You remember, a healthy cell, if the DNA is damaged too much, then the cell will undergo programmed cell death, also called apoptosis. The cell will destroy itself. It will cause itself to die. That way, the cell doesn't turn into cancer. But if too many problems happen to the DNA, then sometimes a cell can become bad and it can start to divide, and it will grow into lots of cells, and those cells are a tumor, and that's how cancer happens. Here's another problem that can happen to cells. Maybe you have heard of a stroke. A stroke is when blood flow is blocked from going to your brain and some cells in your brain die. Remember, we talked about in your brain there are special cells called neurons, and they send messages in your brain to each other. That's how you can think, right? So here I have one neuron that I just drew, and that neuron can send a signal to another neuron here. This is how you feel pain. This is how you can see. There's neurons in your eyes, in your skin, and when you touch something, when you see something, those neurons send messages, and they carry those messages. Whoops. Those neurons carry the messages back to your brain so that you can see and you can feel. But in this image here, you can see there's a blood vessel where the blood flows from your heart up to your brain. And zooming in here, there's a clot. The blood has formed a clot, and now the blood can't get through up to your brain. So you see this dark portion of the brain here. That is the area where oxygen can't get to it. And remember, with cells, if cells can't get oxygen, right? If the oxygen can't get into the cells, then the cells will die. And so unfortunately, in your brain, when someone has a stroke, the blood can't get to that part of their brain. And so the oxygen that is in the blood can't reach. And so all those little cells in the brain, right, the cells like these ones here that send messages, they can't get oxygen, and so they will die. And when cells die from lack of oxygen, we call that ischemia. So this is one example of how cells and their functions can relate to the health of your patients, people that you might take care of. Another important topic is toxins. This is another problem that can happen to your cells. And so here I am drawing cells like you might find on the inside of your intestine, right? So when you eat food, this food comes in to your intestines and your cells can absorb the nutrients. And this can give you energy and vitamins. However, if you eat something that has toxins in it, for example, how many of you have ever had food poisoning? Have you ever eaten something and you got sick from it? If you eat food that has bacteria in it, some of these bacteria, they can create toxins that damage your cells. Some of these toxins, they can go into your cells and they can kill the cells. Right? So people who get these kind of infections in their intestines and their cells start to die, they might start to have blood in their stool. Right? They might have blood in their diarrhea. Another thing that bacteria can do is they can make toxins that go and they enter the cell, or they bind to the cell, and then they change what the cell does. So the cell stops acting normally. So one common type of bacteria, when you get sick with it, it will cause your cells to release lots of water into your intestines. And so when you go to the bathroom, when you're sick, there's a lot of water in your stool, and that causes diarrhea. And so the bacteria does this so that it can hopefully spread, so that your diarrhea will help spread the germs so that other people can get sick, and so that bacteria can go infect other people. So these are examples of how toxins can affect your cells. All right, we're almost to the end of the video. I will now do a summary of what we have discussed about today to help you review and remember what we have learned. We talked about how cells are the basic building blocks of the human body. We also talked about important differences between human cells and bacteria cells. In human cells, we have a cell membrane and we have the nucleus. In the nucleus is where the DNA is stored. And that DNA can be used to build proteins inside the cell and proteins that are used outside the cell to do important jobs in your body. We also talked about bacteria cells. Bacteria cells can come in many different shapes and sizes. Bacteria also have DNA, but they don't have a nucleus like the human body cells do. Some of them also have special structures that can help them to move. In our video today, we also talked about some of the basic parts of the human cell. We talked about the cell membrane. We talked about the nucleus with the DNA. And outside of the nucleus, we have the cytoplasm. That is all the water and other important proteins and molecules that are stored inside of your cell. We also talked about important structures called organelles. Sorry, I will use a different color. Called organelles. And these organelles in your body do important jobs. In our next video, we will go into more detail talking about some of the different types of organelles in your cells and the jobs that they do. We also talked about some important core functions of your cells. For example, we talked about how your cells need to bring in oxygen, and that your cells combine that oxygen with other molecules like sugar, carbohydrates, and also with lipids. And your cells do this so that they can have energy. And your cells need this energy to live. If your cells don't get oxygen and they don't have energy, then the cells will die. We also talked about how cells divide. We talked about how the cells, before they divide, they will make more copies of the DNA, and then they will split into 2 different cells. And each cell will keep 1 copy of the DNA. And this helps your body to heal after you're injured, and it helps your body to grow. We also talked about how cells can communicate with other cells. For example, your cells can make proteins using your DNA, right? Your body will take the DNA and it will make a small copy of the DNA called RNA. And then from that, your body will make proteins and other molecules. And these proteins can do important jobs inside of your cell, and they can also leave the cell, and they can do important jobs outside. For example, these proteins can send messages. They can send signals to other cells. For example, if we have another cell here, that protein can cross over, leave the first cell, and travel through your body, and this other cell can receive that message, and it can help that cell. We also talked about how cells can differentiate. One cell can divide and become different kinds of cells. We talked about many different kinds of cells in the body. We talked about muscle cells, neurons in your brain, in your nerves. We talked about cells in your skin called epithelial cells. And we talked about cells in your digestive system. There are many, many types of cells, more than we can talk about today in one video. But we wanted to talk about different kinds of cells today so that in the future, in our other videos, you'll be prepared when we teach you about new kinds of cells in other organs of the body. And finally, we talked about how when a cell has too many problems and the cell realizes it is not healthy, the cell can undergo programmed cell death. For example, if the DNA has lots of mutations, it has lots of mistakes in the DNA, then the cell can recognize this and undergo apoptosis so that the cell does not cause problems, like turning into a cancerous cell that continues to divide and to grow until it causes problems in the human body. And so that is a brief review of our video today. After this video, we'll have a quiz with some practice questions to help you review what we talked about. In our next video, we will talk about organelles. Organelles are small structures inside of our cells that do important jobs. And so you will learn some of the names of these structures, and you will learn how they work together to keep our cells healthy. And on these slides, we have our attributions for the images that we used in the presentation. And so a big thank you to all the people who created images that we used for this video. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to continuing to learn with you.